Hello and welcome. My name is Kelly, and I will be your host for today's 9 Critical Threats Against Mobile Devices webinar presented by Marble Security. Just a few housekeeping items before I hand the presentation over to Dave. All phone lines will be muted during the call. If you have questions or technical issues, please use the question control panels located on the right of your screen. We will answer technical questions throughout the webinar, and the presenter will answer as many questions as time allows during and after the presentation. Following the webinar, we'll provide a link to the recording of today's presentation via email. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to today's presenter, Dave Jevons, founder and CTO at Marble Security. As Marble's founder, chairman, and CTO, Dave is driving the company's vision, direction, and growth plans. Prior to Marble, Dave founded IronKey, a company that developed and sold over $100 million of highly secure mobile storage devices and online security services, and was sold in 2012 to Emation Corp. Currently, Jevons serves as the chairman of the Anti-Phishing Working Group, a consortium of more than 1,500 financial services companies, ISPs, law enforcement agencies, and technology vendors dedicated to fighting crimeware, email fraud, and online identity theft. Dave, please take it away.
Thank you, Kelly, and welcome everyone to the webinar. Thanks for taking some time out of your day. If at any time you have questions, I encourage you to use the question box. I like to take them anytime during the discussion. You don't need to hold them to the end unless you prefer to. I also would like to just mention that this is an educational webinar about threats and a little bit about what you can do about them. It's not a sales presentation. It is not a technical deep dive into Marble Security products. It really is about learning what is the threatscape out there that we're facing. And if you'd like to schedule another meeting to talk about products and things like that, we'd be happy to do so by contacting me directly or emailing sales@Marble Security. One thing I would also like to recommend to you is if you have some time, take a visit to www.apwg.org. This is our electronic crime nonprofit. We run electronic crime conferences 3 times a year in various locations around the world. We've been doing it for 10 years. It's our 10th anniversary, and I'd like to invite you to take a look at a lot of the research that is there. And we're having our 10th anniversary cybercrime conference in San Francisco this fall. So if you feel like a trip out to California, you're welcome to come and attend and get inside scoop on the latest threats and attacks and defenses. So let's get going about cybercrime and the 9 critical threats against mobile workers. As you know, bringing your own device into a corporation is a very big growing trend. It's as big as the mobility trend. And typically what we're seeing is that that device is what we would call a mobile device, an iPhone, an iPad, increasingly an Android device or tablet. And the fact is that user-owned devices and phones are more than twice as likely to be infected with malware than a corporate-owned asset. But that is really not the only threat. These are the threats we're going to talk about in some detail today. We're going to look at malware on mobile devices. I'll talk about some of the interesting new things that we're seeing in malware, some of the zero-day attacks that we've seen in the last month. Believe it or not, we're going to talk about our friends keyloggers. They do exist on mobile devices. We're going to look at the risks of Wi-Fi hotspots, which your users are using more and more. Upstream issues such as poison DNS, which affect not only browsing but also apps. We'll look at not just malware, but privacy leaking apps, which pose risks to your corporate data and pose a spear phishing risk. We'll briefly discuss jailbroken and rooted devices, unpatched OS versions, and then we'll have a little bit more discussion about the risks of spear phishing and what we're seeing there. I'll break some news about that at the end of the presentation, and then just wrap up about how all of these things are being pulled together as advanced persistent threats to break in to your network and compromise data and compromise systems. Again, at any time, if you've got questions, type them in the question box. So the bring your own device phenomena is introducing new threats. What we're seeing are that in some cases, you've got multiple users per device. So if I bring my iPad into work, perhaps my significant other or one of my kids has been on that device. They've got different apps on there. They've visited different websites, and unbeknownst to me, they may have even jailbroken that device. We're also finding as mobility increases, people are connecting to more and more networks. And we are seeing people connecting to about 10 or more different networks a month. And probably only one of those are controlled by corporate IT. So there's a lot of risk on the network side, and the bad guys are figuring that out. And the other thing we're seeing is that advanced persistent threats almost always start with an attack against the end user. And using that as a hopping off point to jump into the corporate networks and then to start compromising the networks and doing what we call island hopping, which is go from that user, jump into the network, find vulnerabilities in there, cover your tracks, find other systems in the network, and slowly move through the network. And over sometimes a period of many months, the bad guys are in networks getting in there. So the important thing is to defend the mobile perimeter as well as the perimeter of your corporate network, defending the end users from these dynamic, varied attacks that are happening not just at the device level, not just at the app level, but also at the network level. APWG has published a survey recently that you can get off the website about the underground mobile cybercrime market. So what we have seen is that the criminal economy, which has grown over the last 10 years, primarily targeting users of PCs, has now shifted its focus onto the mobile space. They've taken that entire infrastructure of the criminal enterprise and basically added the mobile space to it because they see people using mobile more and more and more. And there are more vulnerabilities in mobile that are more socially oriented, not so much technically, but more socially. We'll talk about what some of those are. But what you can see here is our research showing the different prices that the criminal underground are charging for different aspects of attack software or services on the net to go after mobile users. So we're seeing keyloggers that run on Android selling for $400. We're seeing surveillance systems, so spyware and jailbreak code running for between $500 and $5,000. We're seeing banking malware, and I'll show you some examples of it, running between $10,000 and $30,000. Rentals of mobile botnets, peer-to-peer botnets. We're seeing SEO campaigns to bring people to sites to download infected files and infected APK files, infected applications onto Android. And of course, one of the big areas we're seeing a lot of SMS-type fraud on the mobile space. So there's a whole economy out there which includes the people writing malicious apps, the people doing the phishing, the people doing spear phishing, the folks doing bulletproof hosting, DNS attackers. There are maybe 50 different categories of electronic criminals that are working together in marketplaces and collaborating where you can pick and choose to launch your attack against a company. And of course, almost 90% of companies are supporting remote employees, and a lot of those are moving to the mobile platform. And allowing people to bring their own device is a real phenomenon and a very much a growing phenomenon, and about 60% of companies have implemented one or plan to implement one. Yet, in a survey that we did of hundreds of enterprises, we found out that only 26% have an MDM solution, mobile device management solution, and a third of them know that it isn't effective in addressing all of these concerns. And MDM is great. I mean, it solves simple, nice things like losing your phone in a taxi. That's important, making sure there's a password on it, making sure you can remotely delete it, managing some applications on the device, important stuff. But they're typically static policy-based systems that are not dynamic and adapting to the cybercrime world and the advanced persistent threat world that we're seeing. And there is, frankly, an educational aspect that needs to happen, and thank you for being on this webinar to learn about some of these things. But we found almost 30% of people didn't know what DNS poisoning was. They didn't know about the threats of jailbroken or rooted devices. 45% didn't really understand what they could do about spear phishing or APTs. So let's start looking at these threats in detail one by one. And again, if you have questions as we go through them, you can type them into the box. There's been an exponential growth in mobile malware. We're seeing anywhere between 400 and 700% increase from last year in unique malware and malware families. These are more prevalent on the Android platform, but there are certain types of malicious apps that are popping up on the iOS platform as well. In addition to pure malware, we're seeing that people install by themselves. We're seeing drive-by malware, where the websites that people are driven to check the user agent, and they say, oh, if you're on Windows, I'm going to give you this zero-day attack. Oh, if you're on Android, I'm going to send you an update.apk file, and if you set your device to allow updates from unknown sources, you're going to get that update without you even really knowing what's going on. And while the graph here is not as dramatic as the number of families of PC-based malware, which we've had 20 years to develop, the trend is not looking good. We've seen at the end of Q1, about 150 different families and variants. So these are unique families of malware for the mobile device. Let's look at something in particular on malware that we thought wasn't really possible initially. Well, we know that on the PC, keystroke loggers are one of the main ways that people gain access to user credentials, which can then compromise your network. On the mobile platform, it's thought that that's difficult to do. Well, it turns out that it is difficult to do, but there are simple ways to do it, and I'll give you one example of it. On the iOS platform, you can download an app called Emoji, and it is basically a keystroke interceptor, and it allows you to put little icons and flowers and pictures of rabbits into your text messages and things. That is effectively a keystroke logger that has gone in underneath the keyboard layer and is there intercepting your strokes and allowing you to do other things. The end result is that you need to start scanning apps to look for those types of behaviors. On employee-owned devices particularly, and even on corporate devices, you need to be looking for apps that have that keystroke logging technology. Now, I'm not saying Emoji in by itself is bad, but analysis needs to be done on apps that are doing similar things to make sure that they are not sending keystrokes out over the internet. And that needs to be dynamic because you might get one that's approved by the Apple App Store, and then an update may come that adds, for example, communication to another app or sending off from the device. Now let's look at the issues of Wi-Fi hotspots. This is a complicated one. What we are seeing is that users are accessing 10 or more different Wi-Fis a month, almost all of them insecure Wi-Fis. Sometimes we see a lot more than that if people are traveling internationally. There are a number of different vulnerabilities here. So there are sidejacking attacks, for example, where you can steal cookies from people's sessions on unencrypted links and then take over their session. I'll show you the latest sidejacking tool that's available for you and go take a look at it. All traffic on almost all of these Wi-Fis can be snooped by anyone who's on it, so they can see where your user's going. Are they running VPN traffic or not? Many of these Wi-Fi hotspots in cafes or in airports have the default password set, so people can go in remotely and control them and change the DNS. What we believe is that on any Wi-Fi, users need to be connected to a VPN at all times, which really speaks to having them connected to your corporate VPN, or if they're bringing their own device when they're not on that, connect them to a VPN service that can protect them on these Wi-Fi networks from these different attacks. There was a tool that was released about 2 years ago called Firesheep, and it was the most entertaining tool for people who are in the security business. It was basically a Firefox plugin, and you could sit in a Starbucks or in an airport lounge, fire this thing up in your Firefox browser, and it would basically allow you to take over the accounts of anybody who was using that Wi-Fi hotspot through cookie stealing. So you didn't get their password, but you didn't need it because you could get their cookies and just log right into their accounts, their Facebook accounts, their Yahoo accounts, etc. Entertaining for those of us who are in the security business but aren't malicious, but it shows the power of being able to sniff Wi-Fi hotspots. There is a new tool out there. If you're interested, you can Google it and go to their site, cookiecatcher.com. And basically, this is a much more sophisticated version of Wi-Fi sniffing account takeover tool. It's a good security tool that you can use internally, but it will also demonstrate to you that anybody could be running this off of a Wi-Fi hotspot anywhere in the world and sniffing all of your users' traffic. Of course, we also have to worry about evil twin sites, which is somebody just walks down the street and sets up their MiFi and says, hey, it's free internet, and people connect in, and now they've basically got control of your user's session on their mobile device. Now, DNS is our next vulnerability on the network side that we're seeing. So there are a couple of different things that can happen. So certainly DNS servers are being redirected off of public Wi-Fi to malicious DNS, where they can start adding in entries to route people to bogus websites, whether that's from them going through the browser on their device or an app connecting to a service. They can reroute it. But also keep in mind that most Wi-Fi hotspots aren't providing their own DNS. It's provided by the upstream ISP. So poisoning of DNS can happen upstream at the network, not just down at the Wi-Fi, particularly if the upstream ISP is running an older version of Bind, the DNS server. There are quite a few vulnerabilities found in the older versions of Bind, which allow you to basically poison them with fake DNS entries. So if somebody enters www.mycompany.com and it's been poisoned, it will take them to wherever the attacker wants them to go. We've also seen vulnerabilities in mobile apps where they don't do a good job of certificate validation of the site that they're connecting to. And this means that they could establish an SSL connection to an attacker's site. And we've seen it in the wild on a very large scales as well as on small scales. So we see it on small scales more and more frequently against particular companies, against particular ISPs or particular Wi-Fi. But we've seen it at the country level where Romania and Iran have like their whole DNS completely hijacked and poisoned. Let's look at the next risk. So we've talked about malware and malicious apps. This one is a risk that we face from any device that can download any app. And it is basically the risk that an app may be not purely malicious, but it may leak corporate private information Let me give you a couple of examples of those. So file sharing systems, Dropbox and the like, can be used to share corporate files that are downloaded to the device. That's one. But here's another more subtle attack or vulnerability. Apps that access the address book of a user and upload that to a server on the internet. Now, if that user's address book is connected to your Active Directory server, you've just uploaded an entire copy of every person, their email address, sometimes their title and phone number, to some server on the internet that you don't control. That is perfect fodder for spear phishing, which is the major way that advanced persistent threats are used to get into corporate systems and compromise the internal systems. Almost every APT we've seen has involved some form of spear phishing. So we recommend being able to scan and analyze the apps on users' devices that are connecting to your network, and not just for pure malware, but also for privacy leaking capabilities of those apps, and then allow or deny access to your network based on whether those apps are on that user's device or not, and let the user know why. And we're not going to let you on the corporate network if you've got an app that uploads our entire address book. Let's look at some examples of hacked apps as well. So what we're finding is people will take legitimate apps. Here's a paid version of Angry Birds. They take them, they disassemble them, and they add in malicious code into them, and then they post them for free on a variety of different app marketplaces. We've been scanning over 100 different app marketplaces. We believe there may be as many as 500 of them out there now where people can download apps. And a lot of them are these malicious apps where they take a $10 paid app, modify it, and then post it out for free. And you don't know if your employee is going to go download that on the weekend, or maybe their kid will go download it. Here's an example of a fake Instagram. They localized it into a different language and posted it up there, and it has malicious capabilities. I mentioned SMS interception and fake banking apps. Here's an example of 3 of them. These are basically apps that are promoted as being issued by the company as an authentication tool, and effectively these are used to hijack accounts and allow attackers to break into user accounts. And I mentioned the cybercrime economy at the beginning. Here's an example of them open sourcing this. So in March of this year, the Pertele bot for Android was released, and that allows you to create your own SMS interception code. So if you're using SMS as a second factor of authentication for people to log in instead of, say, an RSA token, people have built these apps now that allow them to intercept it. So they can get the username, password, and then they can intercept it off the phone. Let's talk about the next threat of jailbroken and rooted devices. You really do need to prevent access to your systems and also to the cloud-based systems that your employees use if their device is jailbroken or rooted, because you're effectively got 0 security permissions in those cases. All security permissions are gone. You basically got root access on there. People can install backdoors and SSH servers on those devices. And these devices are pretty powerful. And then you need to check this on employee-owned devices as well as preventing it on your corporate-owned devices. And I've seen some of the latest jailbreak technologies. I mean, I know Apple's doing their best to try to prevent it in hardware and in the operating system, but the latest 6.1 jailbreaking tools are amazing. The thing works seamlessly. So we've also seen not only, your teenage kid goes and jailbreaks your device on the weekend, but we've seen sites that try to lure people into jailbreaking it to take over the device. The next risk related to this are unpatched and old operating system versions. And these are really pretty important attack vectors for criminals. So, as somebody finds vulnerabilities in an operating system, they develop their 0-day, but then eventually that becomes widespread, and more bad guys can use that attack vector. They get put on websites, they get spammed out, and so your users are at more and more risk the longer they're using an older or unpatched version of the operating system. And in fact, there was one that was just patched a week ago by Google, and effectively this thing's been around for about 4 years, and it allows people to take any app, tamper with it, and defeat the digital signature validation that shows that an app hasn't been tampered with. And in the last week, we've been seeing a bunch of it out in the wild. Now that it's a proof of concept that's been published, it took about 7 days for criminals to start using that in the wild, to start publishing tampered with, digitally signed, legitimate apps. And here's the problem we face, particularly on the Android side of things, is fragmentation. This is a map of the number of different Android devices that have been connecting to a certain mapping service. That's 4,000 different device types, each one with a unique ROM, different patch levels, custom code loaded in by the vendor, potentially different hardware configurations, network security settings, etc. When you multiply this by the API levels that people are at, and most people are not on the current version of Android, you've got a really big space for exploitation of the devices. And so we really, really recommend that when you're deploying or allowing people on Android to come into your networks or access your cloud services, that you're able to do a lookup of what is the device, what is the OS, what is the ROM, what is the patch level, and control access based on the security risks that has presented to you. You can see, we're facing some very strong fragmentation out there. The upper left, by the way, is the latest Samsung Galaxy. Let's look at phishing. Phishing continues to explode. There are hundreds of thousands of phishing sites discovered every month. Studies are showing that users are far more susceptible to phishing and spear phishing off their mobile devices than they are on their PCs at work. And there's a couple of reasons for it. One, that small screen, you don't really have a good way to hover over that URL or over that from address in the email and really get a good idea of what you're really connecting to. So we see people are connecting to malicious sites with much more frequency. The second reason is that users are checking their email all the time on their mobile device. Whereas at work, they might check it in between meetings once every hour or two, and probably not at nighttime. But on their mobile device, they're checking it all the time. They're sitting in meetings checking it. They're sitting on the bus checking it. They're sitting in the airport checking it. They're sitting on the airplane checking it. And so they're accessing what we call fresh phishing sites, sites that haven't been taken down, spear phishing sites on their mobile devices at a much higher rate than on their corporate-owned laptops. And the third reason is that on many of these devices, people are reading their personal email as well. They've got their Gmail hooked in as well as their corporate email. And in many of these spear phishing attacks, they're sending it directly to the person's personal email account. So we recommend anti-phishing technologies, anti-phishing networks that can be done through DNS and other means to protect users on their mobile devices. And those, of course, have to be very dynamic with real-time blacklisting and heuristics to look at network traffic to see if people are visiting sites, for example, that were only registered yesterday, or if IP traffic is coming off a user's device that's going to a ASN, a network block that we know has traditionally been owned by the Russian business cybercrime network, that type of thing. If there's any questions on this stuff, you're welcome to type them into the question box and I'll answer them real time. Turns out that spear phishing is on the rise. It is the #1 way that advanced persistent threats are instigated, and because mobile devices are much more prone for people to respond to these things, we really think it's important that blacklisting and tracking and filtering is used on mobile devices in a dynamic fashion to prevent access to phishing sites and to detect spear phishing attacks. The breaking news in this is that there will be a study published next week by a banking security group that is showing that financial institutions are seeing, at least 45% of them are seeing increased spear phishing against their employees. It's a really insidious problem. There are new types of attacks such as watering hole phishing, where people are attacking known websites, putting phishing sites there and collecting user credentials. It's a really growing problem. I encourage you to learn more about it and to talk to us about ways that you might be able to detect and prevent it. So last slide on the sales pitchy stuff is we'd love to talk to you about ways that these things can be prevented, that you can layer on top of an MDM or use instead of an MDM to prevent users with dynamic protection against these varieties of attacks. And with that, I will take, there's a bunch of questions here, so I will start taking them now, and if you have other ones, you can enter them in. So the first question here is, how can people tell which vulnerability to publish to different devices? The way that is typically done is primarily through browser identification strings, where they can tell if you're using, when you visit a site that has been sent to you through email or maliciously published in a search engine, they can determine if you're coming from a Windows PC through the user agent string, or if you're coming through Android browser or a Safari browser. And then what we're seeing is people publishing different exploits or advertisements to download different apps, depending on the type of device that the user has. There's another question here about app scanning and analysis. How does it work? The way that app scanning and analysis works on the mobile devices is it's not done on the device. That takes too much power. The way it's done is it's done in the cloud typically. So devices are scanned periodically for the types of apps that are on it, signatures of the apps. Those are sent out to the cloud, and then if there's something that hasn't been seen before, a copy of the app, one copy of the app is obtained either from the user's device or a marketplace, and then analyzed. And the best approach to this is a combination of static analysis, so looking at the app, seeing what kind of calls that it makes out to the internet, seeing what, so for example, is it accessing the address book and uploading it? That can be done largely through static analysis. The other thing that can be done through static analysis is the app talking to known malicious net blocks, known malicious IPs, etc. So you have to have a pretty dynamic and a large database of IP addresses and bad domains, and then scanning the app and looking for that. Then dynamic analysis involves running the app in a virtual machine and feeding it inputs like usernames and passwords. And the best way to do that is what we call tainting, which is you taint the data, you change the username, and then you look for it coming off the interface of the device as it talks out to the network. And you can see if it's sending, for example, usernames or passwords or files that it's accessed out over the network. Now, there's a question about SSL implementations in the client, and isn't that all built into the operating system? Good question. Typically, on apps, yeah, you're using the SSL implementation in the device, but certificate validation and chaining of certificate validation, we have found is not well implemented on many versions of the OS, and sometimes that requires the device or the application to do it, and that's not done in many cases. So we do recommend apps that you build be scanned. We also recommend the app scanning tools look for that as well. And this prevents man-in-the-middle attacks, and it also prevents apps from connecting to a malicious site, malicious app server, if you're on a compromised hotspot. All right, that's it for the questions. If anyone's got any others, we'll take them. All right, great. Looks like I think we're done. Thank you very much for participating in the webinar and taking 40 minutes out of your day. And if you have any more questions or you'd like to learn more about defense technologies against these threats, then contact us at marblesecurity.com.
Thank you so much, Dave, for your insightful presentation today. If we don't address your question, Dave and his team will follow up with you via email. It looks like we're out of time for today. I just wanted to say thank you again to Dave for his time. As a reminder to the audience, a recording of the webinar will be provided via email in the coming days. Thank you for joining, and we look forward to seeing you on future Marble Security webinars.